Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Russ Winter on the show. Russ, how are you doing?
Perky and caffeinated, to quote Joe Atwell.
Oh, yeah. properly caffeinated. So, Russ, of course, you are the proprietor, I guess, of the New Nationalist website. I've read many of those articles. They're very provocative, interesting stuff. The New Nationalist, what's all that about?
Yes, the newnationalist.net. I think we're just trying to speak truth to power. We do kind of a lot of the same angles that you do. I'm actually a big fan of your show. Listen to a lot of them. And I've even picked up a few story ideas from your show. So a lot of the same. It's just peeling back the onion, a lot of hidden history. And a lot of the history and a lot of things we write about are pretty easily researchable, but amazingly enough, they're not really put out there that much, or they're put out mostly in an obscure way. So the research is possible on a lot of these topics, including the one we're going to talk about today.
So, yeah, you've done this what's called the Sabbatean Frankist or Sabbatean cult that has pretty much functions sort of as a secret society or infiltrating, sort of using the crypto strategy to kind of take over society, subvert it, and use it to its own ends. And this explains a lot of perhaps contemporary stories of elite deviance and sort of financial chicanery. And, the whole, the crime syndicate, as you refer to it,
right.
is what I refer to as the establishment, the crime syndicate. It's been normalized and it's been legitimized to the academic, the academic institutions, media institutions, which are controlled by the crime syndicate. So it's not too surprising that they would create a vast narrative, so the vast majority of the public would be unaware of it and stroll along and let themselves be exploited, from generation to generation. So, the Sabbatean cult, you said there's history there, so let's get into it.
I have read, I got my information from a couple sources. One of them is Rabbi Gershom Schliemann, and then there's also Rabbi Marvin Antelman. That book is called Eliminate the Opiate. The Schliemann book is called Holiness and Sin, and then there's Powell. I can't pronounce the name. It sounds like a Polish name. Masizjoko, who wrote The Mixed Multitude, and then there was a chronicle put out in 1823 by Krauschner, and then a gentleman by the name of Barry Shamish has written about this topic. So I've kind of delved into that a lot. I can see a lot of work needs to be done on this one. It's hidden history, but it all kind of started out in the 1660s with the arrival of a gentleman by the name of Sabbatean Zevi, and he was a messiah. It was a Messianic era. If you look at the history of Judaism during that period, there's constant Messianic movements. People just jump on board one after another. Well, this one took off, and he's estimated to have 1 million followers, mostly Jewish, at its peak, but also within the millenarian movement in the Christian population kind of bought into it, and that's kind of a fact that I don't think a lot of people know. What happened is that he inverted morality. It was based on the Zohar and the Kabbalah, and the Schliemann gets into it a lot. And it's a hard read. It's really beyond me to really understand what the religious basis of this stuff is. And to be honest with you, it's just an excuse to sin. That's how I'd just simplify it. This is like a bunch of chosen, selected persons who are being exempted from moral law. They say the laws of the Torah no longer are valid. It's supremacist gobbledygook that just gives the sect license to be debaucherous, engage in skullduggery and shitstorms and orgies and incest and pedophilia and theft and trickery, inbreeding, a lot of inbreeding. So it's just a really nasty group of people that this religion took hold of. And the way Zevi put it, he says, since we cannot all be saints, let's all be sinners. So you created this movement, and Schliemann calls it Luciferianism. That's what he defined it as. And they also refer to
Yeah, and this is almost like it's because they said the Messiah will come if the world is pure or totally sinful, right?
Yeah, something like that. So, some kind of gibberish like that.
So there's some sort of weird process mentality going on here, where you can immanentize the eschaton through your own actions.
Yeah, you can feel good about being a really nasty person.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's do what thy wilt.
Wow. Yeah, which is interesting, right? Because someone else picked that up.
Exactly.
Is that Philema or something? Yeah, do it. Yeah, do what thou wilt should be the rule. Should be the law of the land or something. It's obviously it's Crowley. Yeah, so that's interesting. Go ahead.
Okay, so it's also described as nihilism on steroids. So without going too much into the little intricacies of Kabbalism, that's how I would process it. That's kind of what we need to know for our purposes in terms of its influence on humanity. It's a threat to humanity, really. So the Sabbatean was basically forced by the Sultan to convert to Islam or die. He was brought before the Sultan, given a choice, and he says, I'll go with the Islam route.
Very practical. You got to
practical.
Very pragmatic. Maybe that's why the British picked him. It's very pragmatic. It's very
Well, that's what his followers said. He said that's very pragmatic, So they adopted really this crypto persona, and this was in Turkey and the Ottoman Empire at the time, and Zevi was in the Ukraine, the Ottoman occupied area of the Ukraine. And there's a term called the Dawnmans, or the crypto Jews, that entered into the power structure of the Ottoman Empire. And it's kind of funny because my son was actually studied at Bogazici in Istanbul, his graduate program, and he's very much an expert on Turkey. And I was talking to him about this. I said, you know that the Young Turks were crypto Jews? And he goes, what? What are you talking about, Dad? Where do you get this kind of nonsense? And I said, well, okay, yeah, they're called the Donmis. And so he goes, and here he is getting this top-notch education, and he's never heard of this stuff. So he's having some beers with some of his Turkish colleagues at school, and he's asking him about it. And he said, oh, absolutely right. You need to listen to your dad.
That's interesting, because I always heard that the Young Turks were it was like a Freemasonic thing. But I can see how that can be confused or interrelated, because, again, part of this crypto infiltration thing, obviously it could be the spirit, or at least the strategy being employed, the same strategy or spirit being employed there.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
There is a tie-in, as we'll get into. So the question then is, after Zevi becomes this Muslim, did the 1 million followers just disappear? And sort of the narrative kind of holds that it did. It's kind of like, oh, well, they just went away. Everybody got discouraged and they went away. But that's not true. They went underground for about 80 years. They became kind of a secret society. They were heavy in Turkey, Poland, particularly Lithuania. There was a group of them in Modena and Leghorn, Italy. Prague became a big center for them, and I'll come back to that later because it kind of ties in later to the Rothschilds and so the later phases of this. And then they gained traction with the Christian millenarians, if I pronounce that correctly, and with the Marrano population, the Jewish converts to Roman Catholicism. And then the richest Jew in Amsterdam, a guy by the name of Abraham Pereira, according to Antelman, was a Sabbatean. So you had some key figures that were operating under this Sabbatean cult. And they basically they held one thing in common besides their degeneracy. They were heralding a destructive arrival of a utopian 1,000-year transformation, and they're pushing for a rebuild of the world, a worldwide compulsory collective, and a total annihilation of any positive system of belief.
Well, that's a theme we see popping up from time to time, right?
Yeah, I mean, would you say communism?
Yeah.
I mean, that's their doctrine.
It's communism and capitalism.
Yeah, you could say capitalism as well.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
Interesting.
So, yeah, and that's what Antelman says. Antelman kind of says exactly the same thing. It's this hybrid capitalism, communism, and this influence of this cult. And there's something about, I don't know, I think there's some advantages to being real sinful, particularly if you're in closed company. So if you have a cult around you and other people operating around you, it gives you huge advantages over other people. And one of the things I've kind of learned in the last couple of years, there's this ridiculous razor. It's called the Hammond's razor. Are you familiar with Hammond's razor?
I'm familiar with Occam's razor, but what's Hammond's razor?
Hammond's razor is that do not attribute to malice what you can attribute to stupidity.
Yes, now I know that. Okay, it doesn't get that. I know that saying. Yeah,
it's nonsense.
Yeah, I know. It's coincidence theory. Yeah,
it's complete nonsense. Yeah. It's somebody, probably some Sabbatean Frankist made that one up.
It's like conspiracy theory, right? When the CIA came up with that term. Yeah,
right. Says, what are you guys talking about? There's not this kind of malice out there in the world. There's no malevolence. These people are just kind of stupid. No, that's not at all how it works. Anyway, continuing on to the story of Jacob Frank. So the movement kind of went underground for about 80 years, and then along comes Jacob Frank, and he lived in 1726 to 1791. He arrived on the scene as a reincarnation of Zevi, Sabbatean Zevi. And up to then, the sect was just kind of simmering under the surface, and he really brought it back. But he was really pushing the idea of world rule. He called it the cult of the all-seeing eye.
So, I mean, now we're getting into sort of like the ideas of the Illuminati, the original Illuminati, and right? I mean,
well, they're using the same symbolism.
Mm-hmm. Same all-seeing eye, and we see that in Freemasonry as well, and of course today with the globalism and with total information awareness, total surveillance, the surveillance state, and these things. CBS, the eye, right? So there you go.
It's world rule. What was a central theme through subversion. The cult of the all-seeing eye, and they actually had 4 godheads, and the final end-game godhead was it was called Big Brother. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, I'm reading all this stuff and going, my God, somebody's got to get this whole story out.
So George Orwell didn't come up with them himself?
I would really love to know.
Wow.
I mean, again, it's the coinky-dink theory.
Yeah.
Huh.
That's interesting. That is, yeah.
So at any rate, unlike Zevi, what happened when Zevi was out there is the synagogue didn't really do any pushback. The Zevi bunch were terrorists, and there were so many of them that the rabbis just kind of stayed out of the way. They didn't really try to counteract them, just kind of hoped it would burn out. And every time they turned around, there was another Messiah. So they were really going through tremendous trouble with this Messianic movements that are going on. But the Frankist, and by the way, the term Frankist was used later to describe them. It was called the sect of Edom. Does that Edom ring a bell to you at all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's the story on that? Anything?
No, I just isn't that going harkening back to biblical times?
I guess so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, that was what they were called. That's what they're called at the time, and Frankism was later invented to describe them as heretics. And the Jewish scholars really nail these guys as heretics. I mean, that's why they've written their books. They're just washing their hands of them. This doesn't have anything to do with Judaism. This is just a runaway group of a sect that's just gone off in another direction. And so that's kind of what they wrote the book back. But I'm kind of more interested in the crime syndicate aspect of how this thing has evolved. So anyway, Frank starts to undermine the synagogue, and he's got shitstorms going on in Poland, actually what's now called more Western Ukraine. What is today Western Ukraine was then Poland, before it was partitioned. Then Russia basically took this territory over. So this is between 1756, and he had a mass awakening of these Sabbateans, and they started accusing the rabbis and the Jews, local Jewish population, of ritual murder, and started undermining them and creating shitstorms between the Catholics and the Judaic population.
Is this the origins of the blood libel?
Oh, I think blood libel even goes back further than that. Yeah. They were playing on the blood libel. I don't know the accuracy of any of the charges. Who knows? But this is the game the Frankists were playing, and so the rabbis excommunicated the whole lot of them. That didn't happen under Sabbatean Zevi.
Hey, Russ, can you hold on for a moment?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so we've got the excommunication of the whole bunch of them by the rabbis. And so in 1759, 13,000 Frankists mass converted to Catholicism in Lviv, which is now Ukraine. And within a year, the Roman Catholic Church booted them out for blasphemous conduct.
Oh, the old days.
Right. Not following our rules, boys. Too much of this incest and orgies going on. So they took Frank. I mean, they didn't want to make a martyr out of him, so they took him and put him into some kind of a convent. I don't know exactly, a citadel or something. And he was detained there for 13 years, living a life of luxury, considerable freedom. He was able to hold court there, send messages out. They didn't restrict him at all. And so, but during this period, now this is kind of even where some of the other authors don't really explain it very well. This whole part I'm coming up on right now is, how did this happen? How did these guys get so much power and influence? And so what he did is that tens of thousands of these Frankists dispersed into Central Europe, and they were sent under 12 apostles, 6 women and 6 men.
Huh. And
they went out into the world, and they basically practiced, you're familiar with the occultist David Berg, flirty fishing. You ever come across that one?
No. Go ahead.
Oh, so in the 1970s, David Berg had these women that he would send out to seduce men, get them in bed and try to convert them into the cult using sex as a draw.
Well, that's one way to do it, I suppose.
Yeah, so they took some of their skills as a cult and aimed high on the social climbing ladder and marriage, and they would target aristocrats and with considerable success.
Yeah, weaponized sexuality. I mean, obviously that's sex as a weapon, whether it's for blackmail or subversion or just, it's an old strategy. So
definitely, these guys were the master of it. And so the ones that couldn't get couldn't marry up the social ladder, they just inbred.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd marry their sisters and reproduce their sisters and cousins. And so it created this double or triple lives of constant name changing. But they hit some home runs in a few places. There was one Frankist by the name of Mayer Arnstein that married into the Wertheimer family. And the Wertheimers were out of Austria and were considered one of the wealthiest families of Europe. So a key marriage. And Antelman stated that they married among themselves. They created these inter-family relationships, just very, very tight-knit families of inbreds, and then veering off to capture an aristocrat here or there. And then they would hold these summer reunions and orgies in Carlsbad. Carlsbad is in the Czech Republic. It's now called Karlovy Vary. So that was a big cult center, as was Prague. So then we come up to finally Jacob Frank is released by the Russians after they partitioned Poland in 1773. And he goes to Brno in Moravia, which is present-day Czech Republic, then the Habsburg Empire. And Antelman says that he goes and stays with his brother, and Schloman says it's his cousin. So there's kind of an inconsistency who this guy was. Mm-hmm. But he's a key figure. His name is Solomon Dobrushka. So I'm assuming that's his brother. And he's a hardcore Frankist who just so happened to hold the potash and tobacco monopoly in Moravia. So he has 8 sons, and just to cover the trails of these guys, 2 of them changed their name to Frey, F-R-E-Y, and became leading hardcore Jacobins in the French Revolution, and eventually guillotined. But another daughter of his, Solomon's daughter, married Israel Honing. Well, Israel Honing is another Jew who holds the monopoly for Austrian tobacco. So some really heavyweight connections going on here.
A lot of wealth and power, yeah.
A lot of wealth and power. So, like I said, the main Frankist centers at this time were Prague, Moravia, or Brno, Hesse in Germany, and Poland. They had this big group of retainers and people around them that never worked. It was never clear how they supported them, but there's always plenty of money. And nobody really explains that. But I guess it's just these intermarriages and getting the right connections to do it. Which means that a lot of people were on board this movement, or at least collaborating with it in some manner. And you got guys like Fritz Springmeier. I don't know if this is true or not. I mean, something probably needs to be investigated. It claims that Billy Graham is a direct descendant of Jacob Frank.
That's interesting. The recently departed Billy Graham. That explained his meteoric rise in the 50s. And, he was promoted by the CIA in these things in the 50s. He became sort of the court evangelical to promote Americanism and American geostrategy.
Yeah, where did they pluck him from, right?
Yeah, he just became this celebrity in the 50s, and of course in the television era and these things. It was the revival movement of the 50s and these things. And,
Well, for the normie listening to this conversation here, they're probably just shaking their head. Like, we're just not in Kansas anymore, folks.
No. So Fritz Springmeier, who of course wrote the book Bloodlines of the Illuminati. And, and it sounds crazy to know, well, wait a second, there is some of his research is pretty good on that, these family connections, and,
Well, the quickie dink fact.
Yeah.
So you got, next thing you know, Jacob is down, he's been invited to go down to join the court of Maria Theresa in Vienna.
Oh. Yeah. Okay,
and he convinces her, he's running a scam with her, because Maria Theresa was very interested in converting Jews to Catholicism. It was one of her favorite royal projects. Mm-hmm. So he was able to convince Maria Theresa that he could help out with that project. And
so she's like sort of the gullible goyim. Sort of?
I guess so.
Okay.
Well, they didn't buy into it for long. They kicked him out because of his conduct. He just couldn't. These people just couldn't behave themselves. Mm-hmm. They would get into trouble, shitstorms. And while they were there, though, his daughter Eva consorted with the future emperor Joseph II.
Okay, so he was farming his children out for.
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely. The son of Solomon, going back to Solomon again, Solomon Dobrushka, which I think is a major character. I don't think they really give him enough attention in these books, because he just jumps. His offspring kind of jump up all the time. His offspring is named Moses Dobrushka. Got together with some Austrian nobles and formed the Masonic Lodge, the Vienna Order of the Asiatic Brethren. Does that one ring a bell to you? The Order of Asiatic Brethren.
No, I'm generally familiar with Grand Orient, Freemasonry, the Continental versus the British Freemasonry. But that's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know the meaning of that, but it became a big center of Frankist Freemasonry.
Yeah, I mean, the moment you see a lodge in Freemasonry being set up, your suspicions have to be raised, because these lodges are sort of centers, or at least it's a form of technology for occult communication, networking, and subversion. So,
Right. Right. So Antelman really does address the Masonic infiltration. He hits it hard. He says this is it. This is it. This is key to how they did a lot of stuff. My theory is that they were successful. He doesn't explain the method they used, though. He just said, well, they just got into power. They started running these shows.
Well, I think can we assume it's just money and sex and human weakness? Exploiting human weaknesses. That's So
bingo. Yeah, they provided the vices, the girls, the booze, and then they could compromise. They had the dossiers on people. And during this period, they also set up a spy network. Well, the other thing that's going on in Europe at this time is, I wrote that article on the Hellfire Club. This is happening at the same time. Dashwood. Yeah. And it's the Enlightenment, and it's this whole unleashing of this sort of perverted. It's like people are sort of trying to break out of this medieval church-structured society by kind of going nuts. Kind of like the sexual revolution.
Yeah,
the 60s.
Yeah, exactly. It was a revitalization of that, and you sort of had a culture revolution or a sexual revolution in this time, but without the benefit of or the aid of mass communication and technology. You could never permeate the mass culture. You could just sort of this very narrow elite sect, that had the benefit of wealth. They could transcend the normal concerns of everyday life, which most people eke out a living just to, so they wouldn't starve to death, keep a roof over their head, a thatched roof over their head.
They got to have all the fun and all the vice. Yeah. And so they set up a spy network, and this is where it kind of eventually ties into the Rothschilds, because there was an investigation done. I'm just kind of getting ahead of myself. I'll get to that in a second. Continue on here. So they penetrated the Austrian and German aristocracy with this kind of Jewish Catholic mask with Frankist morals. Mm-hmm. And one of the key families was the Van Honingbergs. This is for any of your researchers out there. Von Bienfeld. And the documents have largely been described by the descendants. So it's just hard to get the documentation of these families, but the marriages are clearly there with Frankists. But they've scrubbed a lot of detail. So Frank died, and Frank goes off to after he gets kicked out of the court of Vienna, he decides to go up to the Frankfurt area, just right outside of Hoffenburg. And at the same time, there were a number of them in Poland. There's 24,000. Contemporary accounts say there's 24,000 Frankists in Poland after Frank's death. And they escaped both the Jewish and the Catholic authorities, so they kind of lived this life in the middle. By the 1830s, most of Warsaw's lawyers were Frankists.
Some things never change.
And they were also radical. They were into radical politics. They were innkeepers. They ran their loan sharking operations. They ran brothels. And they teamed up as henchmen of the Polish nobles. So there's an alliance there, too.
Yeah, that's that's something you see where they kind of form a partnership with the princes and the kings to screw the public,
or to work a scam.
Yeah, the same way you saw like the Jewish WASP alliance in the 20th century United States with the Rockefellers, and these things,
So anyway, there's conjecture that Adam Weishaupt was a Frankist, but I don't think he was Jewish. I think he was Catholic.
Yeah, he was Jesuit trained. Was not a Jesuit. He was Jesuit trained, and I thought his father was a convert, which I always thought was interesting to me.
That he was a
I might have that.
Verso?
I had that detail wrong. I have the book Perfectibility, but I haven't read it yet. It's about the Illuminati. It's supposed to be one of the best scholarly works on the Illuminati. The Bavarian Illuminati. I mean, the real history of it, as opposed to the stuff we hear about Illuminati, in Taco Bell commercials and stuff like that. But I don't know if you're familiar with that where you are, but in the States recently, Taco Bell has picked up the Illuminati theme to promote their tacos. So I thought that's interesting.
It seemed that the Vatican disbanded the Jesuits.
Yeah.
Right. So that group kind of started morphing into Freemasonry as an operating tool because they had a lot of money. I mean, the Jesuits had a lot of power, influence, and money.
Yeah, the story
they didn't just disappear just because the Vatican dissolved them.
Yeah, the story of the Illuminati is, I think, because Weishaupt was Jesuit trained, he employed their tactics and their strategy for the Illuminati. The idea of, that's how I understand it. But I always thought it was Weishaupt. I thought his father was a convert, which I always thought was, you're getting into this, is this a converso thing? Is it infiltrating the offices of the church which we see today, I mean, particularly in the modern era with the CIA and Vatican II, is you don't destroy the church. Which the Illuminati wanted to destroy all throne and altar. The modern strategy is you subvert throne and altar, and you use those offices to achieve your ends, as opposed to overtly you're trying to take it out because that's going to create too much resistance. You subvert it, and that's, if you look around, that's largely what's being done to subvert these offices. But I'm sorry, go ahead. You were talking about...
I think that's it. So there's some question of who he was, but I think that he probably was Jesuit trained, and even if he wasn't a crypto, they were natural allies.
Yes.
To the Frankists. So there was kind of a tie-in there, and then Weishaupt was apparently working as an agent of Rothschilds. So it fits together.
Yeah, because
the exact details don't necessarily, but
because if you're attending the same orgies, or at least having similar orgies, you're going to have right? I mean, it's going to have the same outlook, like the Hellfire Club, right? I mean, right? I mean, it's
that's what's going on here. They probably had same proclivities, and they're doing the same thing. They're party animals.
Yeah.
So anyway, 1786, Jacob Frank goes to Offenburg, which is right outside of the Rothschild's headquarters in Frankfurt. And then when Frank dies in 1791, they kind of act like, oh, well, the movement just fell apart and disappeared again, just like after when Zevi died. But there's an important footnote, and I'm kind of glad I stumbled on this, and I actually found this just a few days ago, just doing a little extra reading. There was an investigation in 1800 by the Prussians, and they did an investigation by a guy named Chancellor Forney, Forney, who was looking into the sect. And first he thought the sect of Edom was mostly a scam, but then they switched gears and said that it was a religious sect as cover for political purposes and infiltration. These are his words.
Well, we see that, with today, with the use of cults and religious groups, and using missionaries for intelligence purposes. Think of Jonestown.
Yeah,
but go ahead. That's interesting.
Just we're not in Kansas anymore. The normies have got to get out of their little box. I mean, even I do. It's just kind of like, wow. It's so you got. Then they go on. He says the Prince of Eisenberg let the Frankists become a state within a state. This is from the report this guy wrote. So then I just kind of let's do a little search of the Prince of Eisenberg and Rothschilds. Just an internet search. And all kinds of things pop up. He was the Amsel Rothschild was the court agent of the Prince of Eisenberg. Mm-hmm. He was giving Eisenberg lots of loans. They were buddies.
Yeah.
So he just let these Frankists come in there. So the theory is our Amsel and Nathan and the Rothschilds families Frankist. When did they become Frankists? Mm-hmm. Are they part of this whole same network?
And if not officially, in spirit, right?
Well, you think about it. So meanwhile, the Russians and the Austrian authorities are investigating these guys in Warsaw and Poland and some of these other areas. They're calling them a subversive transnational spy network.
Isn't it interesting that these are both a Catholic and Orthodox area that has the balls to investigate this?
Right. The Russians did.
Yeah, So that's.
Well, they hadn't been undermined.
Yeah, It's obviously that's what's going on. At least that's what it appears to be. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So anyway, just a little footnote. Even Goethe knew about them. He called them a masquerade. He thought they were kind of clownish masquerade because that's how they presented themselves in kind of a clownish fashion.
You mean like Eyes Wide Shut parties?
Yeah, all that kind of stuff.
The mask.
And so you think about it, you got this network already set up of spies in this Masonic network. And what a natural fit for the Rothschilds' plan of transnational banking. It's just perfect.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah, because
bingo.
It was Nathan who sent his sons abroad, right, to these major cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, and a city. What city was it in Italy that he went to? All these banking centers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and they have this whole network already set up through these Frankists, who are hardcore, tools.
And also they're bastard children, which again it has a element of crypto to it, because you don't know. Apparently, from what I understand, is like August Belmont was a illegitimate descendant of the Rothschilds who came to America to promote Manifest Destiny. Who married, I think, Commodore Perry, who went to Japan. In the 1850s with this gunboat diplomacy. So that these networks sprawl out, and again, we're getting the issue of bloodlines and using these things as sort of a networking and also a reliable way to not only network but also to spread your tentacles throughout the world.
Well, I have the number here. Let me just look at it and make sure I get this right. Okay, here it is. 29 of 58 of Mayor Amsel Rothschild's grandchildren married first or second cousins. They must have been Frankists.
Yeah, and that's got to have an effect on your genetics, right?
Yeah, it also really keeps a really tight-knit structure.
Yeah.
You're not bringing in too many outsiders. You got people that totally get the program. Of course, the inbreeding creates a certain problem, like mental illness.
Yes.
So combine Frankism with inbreeding, and you're probably coming up with some pretty nasty brew there of turning these people loose on the world. And I think there's something to it.
Does it also create hemophilia?
Maybe.
Yeah.
So anyway, the next step was that the titular leadership passed to the daughter, Eva, who had seduced the Emperor Joseph II in Vienna. And she was declared the reincarnation of the Virgin Mary. And just when they thought that they weren't going to hear from these guys anymore, they sent out hundreds of red letters to the Jewish communities all over Europe, urging conversion, rebellion, and an apocalypse. And then Eva started to claim to be the illegitimate daughter of Tsarina Elizabeth. Now, I don't know that I believe that or not, because these guys are just liars. Mm-hmm. They would concoct all kinds of stuff. But on the other hand, she spoke fluent French and was a master musician. Where does a Frankist girl learn to do that?
Yeah.
She may have been in the court.
Yeah, it sounds like, obviously in a royal court where, these things would be, she received that type of instruction.
Right. And so then in November 1813, Tsar Alexander rode out to Offenburg to meet her after the Battle of Leipzig. Why? No, it's just a fact. You went out, decided to take a look at her. Now, is there a connection there, or are we just doing the ultimate hoaxers? And these guys are the ultimate hoaxers. The Hellfire bunch under Dashwood just loved hoaxes. They loved pulling the wool over people's eyes. Then after Frank's death, the power shifted to an old line family, Sabbatean family from Prague. It had been Sabbateans even before Frank. They'd been from the pre-Frank phase. And there are about 4 or 5 big families, very, very wealthy Prague families. One called the Wheelies, W-E-H-E-L-E, the Bondis, the Porges were out of Venice. So you got a Venice connection there. And the Zerkowitz or Berkowitz family. And they kind of started to change the messaging a little bit. They started talking about liberation from Roman bondage, which is the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. and calling for a new Jerusalem where they would rule the roost. So because they were kind of high upper class members of Prague society, their external moral conduct was totally normal. But behind closed doors, eyes wide shut. Mm-hmm. Necromania, incest. They were very heavily into group masturbating, this whole masturbation thing, which you kind of hear nowadays too among some of these Judaics.
Yeah, and also, from what I understand, skull and bones, but that's
right.
In the sarcophagus where
group sex, permitted theft, and perjury. So behind closed doors, out of sight, these guys were just total wild men, and they were into the liberation of the feminine principle. They worshipped Esther, who was basically disobedient and conniving. That's what Esther was.
Feminism. No.
So to kind of wrap this up, I was going to read this part about this clan. Let me go up here. Here it is. Gottlieb Wieland came to the United States with a large constituency of Frankists from Bohemia and Moravia after the revolution in 1848. One member of the clan was Louis Brandeis.
Oh, interesting.
The Supreme Court justice, an ardent Zionist who was instrumental in promoting the Federal Reserve Bank. And then also Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter is reported to have received a copy of Eva Frank's portrait from his mother, who was a descendant of the Prague Frankist family. And then there was another family called the Itzigs, I-T-Z-I-G, out of Berlin, that were very powerful, and they kind of married into another powerful Frankist family and controlled it's kind of like the head of the Berlin Illuminati is kind of how they're described, and the purveyor of silver to the Royal Prussian Mint. Along with banker merchant H. Hiram during the 7 Years' War, he issued debased coinage that not only contributed to inflation, but helped the Prussian government fight the war. These two powerful Frankist families were later joined in marriage. So these guys are operating even really before the Rothschild dynasty took out. So they're already there. They're already in place. This network is already in place. And then I mentioned before, the Arnstein had married Teresa Wertheimer, the granddaughter and banker of Chief Rabbi Samson Wertheimer of Austria. And Rabbi Wertheimer was considered to be the wealthiest Jew in Europe. He was the financial administrator for the emperors Leopold I, Joseph I, Charles VI, and supervised their diplomatic missions. This earned him the nickname Judenkaiser, or Jewish Emperor. Arnstein, in turn, financed the Tyrolese peasant revolt against France and Bavaria. And I think if you just really started peeling back the onion, you'd see them financing these wars.
He's like kind of a prototypical George Soros or something?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And then here's the final Rothschild connection. Frank is living in regal style. He had a militia. How does he get the money? Who's giving it to him? When he established himself in 1789 in the Frankfurt suburb of Offenbach, they were patronized by quote-unquote unidentified philanthropists of the quote-unquote Frankfurt community. But during the Frankfurt Masonic Lodge's formative years, the three most active members of the Frankfurt Juden Lodge were Frankfurt influenced: Sigmund Geisenheimer, Michael Hess, and Justus Heller, who were also leaders of the liberal Jewish reformist movement. Michael Hess was hired by Mayor Rothschild as a tutor for his children. Mm-hmm. Geisenheimer was Mayor Rothschild's head clerk. End of story.
So definitely a network.
Yeah, I think that there's. I would love to see somebody like Joe Atwell dig this thing a little deeper, write a book on this.
Do it, Joe. That's yeah, and of course you have the story of the Rothschilds. Their ascendancy occurs at the Battle of Waterloo, where he's able to short. He gets advanced information of Napoleon's defeat, and he spreads false information of Napoleon's victory in London. So the market tanks, and he's able to get out and buy everything in a song. Then it shoots up after the real news is reported of Napoleon's defeat, and that's the source of his vast fortune from then, and the rest is history because they get into banking. And what really served their interest was the sort of the decadence of the aristocracy, the British aristocracy, and this goes back to the British, Reformation, the English Reformation, where the acquisition or the taking of church property, the dispersion of the monasteries, these things. A few well-connected British families got these vast estates, but they were cash poor. So in the 19th century, they started borrowing a lot of money to build these manor homes, and of course the creditors were Jewish. And throughout the 19th century, these aristocratic families like the Spencers and the Churchills and these families went increasingly into debt to bankers like the Rothschilds. And the Rothschilds leveraged that debt to gradually get control of the British state. In fact, the purchase of the Suez Canal was financed by Rothschilds. And I think there's I think I've talked about this before, but there's an account. I was watching a PBS series on Queen Victoria, and this was during the premiership of what's his name? The Jewish Prime Minister. Disraeli, yes, Disraeli. And Disraeli was a friend with Rothschilds, and Disraeli is trying to acquire the Suez Canal, I think from French investors, I think how it worked out. And he couldn't get Parliament in session to raise the funds, so he goes to Rothschilds to raise the funds. And the account is that Rothschild looked at him and said, well, what do you have as collateral for this loan? And he says to him, I offer you the British state.
Yeah, right.
And that's sort of encapsulates how these bankers get control of governments through debt. And, of course, the experience of the Churchill family, both Winston and his father, they were always spending more money than they had, and they were in love with the luxurious lifestyle, their cigars and their alcohol and their manor homes, and they were always bailed out by the Rothschild. And
well, the thing about the system that they set up of banking, which kind of leads a little into the Parasite Guild articles that I wrote, which I don't know if we can go into today, but they just don't ever forgive debt. It's like they have it. It's a Judaic religious tenet that forgiving debt owed to a Jew is equivalent to a Holocaust. A genocide.
Yeah, well, that gets. Yeah, I mean, you get into in some of your other articles. You spell out this networking or this occulted society of Sabbateans and Frankists and getting into finance and getting into banking and through alliances with governments. And governments are always addicted to debt too because they always want to spend more money than they have or spend other people's money. And this is how they do it through the bank system. Having a middleman is easy because when the peasants get angry, they get angry at the Jews and not the government. So it's a great way to periodically, hey, I didn't do it, he did it. But
the debt never seems to be forgiven. I mean, in modern times, the two events in modern times that illustrate this and this just blew my mind when it happened because I was following financial markets a lot closer. But when they reworked the Greek debt a few years ago, there's a concept called parsupari. And parsupari is an ancient concept that all debt is created equal. So if you have a bond issue of $100 million, the same issue, then you can't favor one debtor over another. Well, they did.
Yeah.
They said, no, the central bank, the ECB is not going to take the loss. All you other suckers are. So they haircutted the public or the poor guy's money or the guy at the bank or somebody that owned the Greek sovereign bonds, they haircutted him and made sure that these central bankers or banksters were left whole. And then the other experience was Argentina. I mean, they just worked Argentina over the coals. Argentina was trying to offer, well, why don't you take a haircut of this amount and that amount, trying to negotiate a restructuring of that sovereign debt, and they were just relentless. The Parasite Guild was just relentless. They just drag them into their courts. That they own these, they control the New York courts, they control the London courts where the covenants of the bonds are written, and rake them over the coals and just pretty much extract every pound of flesh they can get out of them. And that's the world we're in right now. That brings us to the present day and the situation that we're facing, because there's an enormous amount of debt out there, and they've established some very bad precedent with this Parsi Paru where they can pick and choose who's going to lose. And I think it's going to be the pensions, that they're going to hit them with big losses. They're going to mark down all these assets in these financial crises. They're going to sweep in with all the money and just scarf everything. That's where your New Jerusalem is going to come from. Just a complete Parasite Guild takeover of the world. Just getting the assets really cheap and wiping people out. That's my greatest fear.
Yeah, the way they do that, of course, what you're spelling out there is sort of that John Perkins economic hitman model. Mm-hmm. And of course, the basis of that is debt, and gone is the notion of odious debt, which is a function of part of international law. Odious debt, where debt is seen as being illegitimate because it's a debt that's incurred by a regime for purposes that don't really serve the people of the nation. And so the people didn't sign on to this debt; these corrupt leaders did. So if you if you were to reinvigorate or reassert this notion of odious debt, that this debt is no good anymore, because one thing it's a pyramid. We're created by money out of thin air, right? So this is all money that was never saved. There's no one's savings that were put at risk. These are banks that are creating money out of thin air and charging interest on it. And at the end of the day, the bigger banks aren't even incurring any risk. So there's no even a surface or a superficial justification for interest rates in this system. But in the end, you're getting back to the system of usury, which is used to concentrate wealth. And also it's done through inflation, which is debasing the currency, which is another form of taxation, all benefiting a few bankers and corporations that are at the top of the economic food chain.
Well, there's a great documentary, and I wish I could remember the name. I should have kept a note on this. It might be in one of my articles. I'm pretty sure it is, but it escapes me. It talked about what happened in Argentina. Essentially, they just put a corrupt government in there that just went nuts in the capital markets, borrowing money and getting Argentina in big trouble. Well, that's the responsibility of these bankers.
Yeah.
You made the loan. You may have put this Yahoo in there. You may have controlled him, but you made the loan, and you need to eat the loss. That just seems like a very simple concept to me, but it doesn't exist in this world, in this kind of Rothschildian Frankist world.
Goldman Sachs is too big to fail.
Yes, you got to make sure they're whole.
Another doctrine, and this whole idea of, remember the biblical notion of a jubilee every 7 years, right? You wipe the books clean.
But that's kind of a joke.
Yes.
It doesn't exist. It's in there with Hanlon's razor.
But the idea is, again, if these banks, again, they've created a central banking warfare model where the banks create money, and literally they create it they create digital money that can be used to acquire real assets. I mean, real physical assets. And of course, if you're getting that money first, you're always going to be in a position to rig the markets to your benefit, and that's why the system was set up the way it was. I mean, that's why the crime syndicate set up the central banking system. There was in the next phase in these things. They could always rig the markets. But yeah, Greece is a great example where they outfits like Goldman Sachs cook the books to get these huge loans through. So the ECB, so it superficially meets the standards of the European Central Bank. The debt ratio and these things. And when they're caught doing that, they're not charged with fraud. No one goes to jail. But Goldman Sachs took its commission, and then they got this bad loan, and then next minute, Greece is forced to sell islands in the Parthenon or something to some.
Yeah, well, they're trying to privatize, and they're actually having kind of a hard time. There's a lot of blowback. Privatizations are just tough to execute, so they may have to come at them again with another crisis.
Yeah,
you have to kind of keep working them over. But yeah, that's a really important point about how Goldman Sachs cooked the books for them so they could borrow the money. And then when they get into trouble, who gets the passes? These big international banksters. They're kept whole.
Yeah, yeah. And that's an old. I mean, I was reading about. I've heard the Don Pacifico affair in the 19th century. It occurred around the 1850s, roughly around the same time as the so-called Irish potato famine. But this is the sort of the insidious and evil nature of debt. Well, one thing is much of the British, the so-called potato famine. Well, it was a potato famine because the British had relegated the Irish population to eating potatoes. All the food was exported. So when the famine hit the potato, there wasn't any alternative food source. But at the same time, the British maintained the exports to maintain the interest payments to the bankers, ultimately.
Right.
But at the same time, there's this Don Pacifico affair. And he was this Jewish guy who was at one time British, renounced his citizenship. I think it was now Turkish or Spanish. But he was involved in finance. He had loaned the Greek government some money, or some Greek creditors some money, and apparently the people, who he loaned the money to, wasn't making good on the payments, and it's more or less a private loan, and somehow or another the British Navy comes in and threatens to bombard Athens or Greek cities, the Greek king, if they don't pay the loan back. And it turns out that Don Pacifico was a Rothschild agent.
Yeah, I never heard that story.
Yeah. That's
a good one.
At the same time, the British government's claim that we don't have the resources or the ships to provide relief for the starving Irish, they can send the Navy there to threaten to bomb Greek cities to pay this gentleman's debt, who isn't even a British subject, by the way, anymore. But this shows you the international cosmopolitan nature of these folks. Meaning,
the way they carried it out in Ireland was the same. They just extracted all the extra food. There was food in Ireland to feed people, but it was basically needed to cover the loans and other obligations. And there was a general food crisis, higher food prices around Europe at the time. It was kind of famine conditions generally. So Ireland was like the bottom of the sack. And that's my main argument for nationalism. Because if you get in an emergency situation like Ireland got into, you're going to take care of your own people. Because the same thing happened in Scotland. They had a famine, but because Scotland had a different system. They had a clan system up there. So the property owners and the people responsible were the kin.
Yeah.
And so they took care of their fourth cousins.
Yeah, and also at the same time, you create dire conditions in a country, then that labor can then be exported. One thing is, you see this in Haiti, and some of the scandals that arose last fall regarding the Clinton Foundation, these things about human trafficking and this exploitation of, which is the ultimate exploitation of human labor, I guess. But also what we've heard about the underground organ transplant trade. These things, how people are more or less being killed for their organs, and if you look at it from a purely economic standpoint, the human body is worth a couple $1 million.
Yeah.
If you look at the price of organs, and so if you're looking at sort of from a Newtonian British view of the world, it makes economic sense to go in, collapse markets, and exploit the resources, which could be the literal bodies of the native population. Throughout history, it has been. Look at the slave trade.
Yeah, you gotta have your family, and you have to have your kin. Like the Scottish saved themselves from the famine because of that. People don't know that
because they had a ethnic identity.
Well, they just had, it was a feudal structure, so you had these wealthy Scots that owned the land, and they were subservient to them, but because they had the clan identity and the national identity and the ethnic identity of their own people, they took care of them.